May 2015. A young man is interviewed by police investigating 2 murders.
Look, my voices were talking to me. You need to make a sacrifice or we're going to come and get you. You need to do it.
He admits to the savage attacks on 33-year-old James Atfield and 31-year-old Nahid Al-Manea.
Both of them, very unusually, were stabbed through the eye sockets.
He would have put himself in the position as the judge, jury and executioner when he came upon them.
James Fairweather later said that voices in his head had told him to commit his heinous crimes.
I stabbed him first there. I'd done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing and laughing and laughing louder and louder.
But these shocking and brutal murders belie one extraordinary thing about their perpetrator when he committed them. He was only 15 years old.
It was just a huge sense of shock and disbelief.
March 2014. 33-year-old James Atfield was stabbed to death as he slept in a park in Colchester, Essex. The attack baffled police at first. The incident appeared to be unprovoked on a seemingly innocent person. The victim had already experienced trouble during his short life. His circumstances and his state of mind meant he often had difficulty making simple decisions.
Jim, as he was known to his friends and family, was a young man living in Colchester. He had had troubles in his life. He'd had been involved in a car accident, hit by a car when he was younger, which caused quite a severe brain injury.
He stayed at home with us for quite a while after he'd come out the coma because he couldn't do anything for himself.
James Atfield's last movements were tracked to some extent by CCTV. He wasn't in constant communication with friends and family to tell them where he was. So he was last seen in the River Lodge bar in Colchester, and he was captured on CCTV, putting down an unfinished drink and walking out.
I'm assuming he stayed in the park because he was still in his smart trousers, smart shoes, where if he'd gone home, he probably would have taken them off and changed. And for what I can gather, he probably fell asleep in the park because due to his accident, being hit by the car, it affected that part of his brain, which obviously is your consciousness. So obviously he'd had a couple of beers. Unlike any of us who have a few beers, we don't normally just fall asleep. Because he'd had a couple, he was sitting down, he probably just dozed off.
Lying down was his fatal error. Waiting to kill was 15-year-old James Fairweather, whose mind was telling him to sacrifice a stranger. The attack was frenzied and sustained.
He was looking for a victim, a sacrifice that he could make. He obviously didn't find anyone on his journeys or no one suitable that he felt he could attack without fear of getting hurt himself. And so as he ventured through the park, he came across Jim Atfield and it would seem saw him as a likely sacrifice as James Fairweather saw it. We heard during that the attack lasted for up to 3 minutes, and we heard in James Fairweather's words that it was quite a frenzied attack. That's borne out by some of the post-mortem examination and the details that revealed. Jim Atfield had a number of cuts and lacerations to his arms, which suggested that he was trying to defend himself, perhaps during the attack.
Obviously, I think he had a lot of cuts on his upper body, like torso and all round there. I think he had holes in his hands where he'd obviously put his hands up to protect himself, basically. And I think he had a big cut here as well, like along here somewhere.
And James Fairweather as well said that there was some resistance from Jim Atfield until the point that he stabbed him in the eye, at which point Jim Atfield's defence seemed to falter.
He was stabbed 102 times. It was a horrific, ghastly murder that startled some senior officers from the investigation team. And he would have suffered terribly. In fact, when he was found by a passerby, he was still alive. It actually happened in the early hours of the morning. And he died at the scene whilst paramedics were working on him before he was brought to hospital. It was an incredibly sad murder, very brutal, very gruesome, and as I said, police realised they were dealing with a very disturbed, violent individuals. James Fairweather did not know James Atfield. He attacked him in the park at night in the early hours whilst he was in a vulnerable state on his way home from the local public house. So police were aware they were looking for a very violent offender, a very disturbed offender. But as I said, they would not have expected a 15-year-old schoolboy to have been responsible.
So just who was James Fairweather and what caused him to do what he did? James Fairweather was a pupil at Colchester Academy and, like most teens, often skipped school. No one thought his movements might have had darker intentions.
James Fairweather was a young man who lived in Colchester with his parents. He went to a local school, and what was interesting about the background to the case was that in his early years at school he was a hard-working and sensible boy who didn't get into trouble. But as he went into his teens, he started becoming more disruptive.
Regularly being left alone at home, Fairweather would meticulously study serial killers, watch violent pornography, and feed his addiction that would lead him in time to kill.
James Fairweather came from a reasonably stable background. But the reality is, as he got older, into his early teens, he became socially awkward, he became reclusive. He also was experiencing problems at school. He was bullied. He was bullied due to his protruding ears, and he was called things like Dumbo and FA Cup and that kind of thing. And that caused a lot of anger within him. Now, when you have an obsession with murder and serial murder, and you couple that with anger, again, we're talking about combinations. It was a lethal combination with James Fairweather. He was so obsessed with violence and murder to the point that he was fantasizing about killing the bullies at school who tormented him, about raping schoolgirls. That when you have that obsession, and it got so out of control that he couldn't contain it anymore, that, coupled with the anger he was experiencing, manifested itself in him committing his first murder.
James Fairweather had already carried out an horrific murder in 2014. While knowing nothing about him, police were frantically trying to locate a killer on the loose. But the 15-year-old had no intention of stopping what he'd brutally started. Father of 5, James Atfield, died of horrific stab wounds after a knife attack in Colchester, Essex in March 2014. Police had begun an intensive investigation, and the assumption was that a potentially lethal, experienced killer could be at large. But the killer was a 15-year-old schoolboy, James Fairweather, and he was about to strike again.
80 days after the murder of Jim Atfield, a second murder occurred in Colchester on the Sallery Trail, closer to the Greenstead estate where James Fairweather lived.
The victim this time was a woman, 31-year-old Nahad Al-Manea, a Saudi national who was studying at the University of Essex.
She was studying an English language course. James Fairweather had presumably been searching for other victims in between times, other sacrifices that he could make. And on this day, he came across Nahid walking unusually alone, as she often was accompanied by a family member or friends on the walk to university.
I think she was coming from her house in Greenstead, which is a few miles from here, maybe 3 miles. And she was coming here to attend her first class. And it looks like she was coming a bit early, actually. She was supposed to be at university at 11, and she was killed. Well, she passed in front of one of the shops in Greenstead about 10:20, and there was a video by the police about that. So she was killed between 10:20 and I think 10:40, in these 20 minutes, when she was found by, I think, a student on the path there, lying down. So by the time the police arrived, she was pronounced dead.
Nahid Al-Manea was unlucky that the trail is often busy with people walking to and from the Greenstead estate where a number of students live and the university campus. So for him to find an opportunity where she was alone was probably a rare one. During the attack, he attacked her from behind to begin with.
She was stabbed 16 times, and she was stabbed in the abdomen, and she was actually stabbed through the eye with the blade inserted into her brain. It was an extremely violent, very violent murder. Part of the reason, I believe, why she was only stabbed 16 times in comparison to James Atfield being stabbed 102 times is because Nahid Al-Mania was murdered in broad daylight in the morning time, which would indicate that the killer, in this case James Fairweather, had to get away because he was aware that someone could have walked around the corner, could have come along and seen what he was doing. He had to escape. In regards to James Fairweather, he was in a park in the early hours of the morning. There were very little to nobody about at that time of the morning. That was the key difference, in my opinion, as to why James Atfield, was stabbed 102 times and Nahid Al-Mania was only stabbed 16 times. But despite that, she suffered horrific injuries. She died a very painful and horrific death.
The killing of Nahid led to panic, particularly in Islamic circles, and the idea that a serial killer might be killing randomly just heightened the sense of fear.
Well, on the first 2 days, some people panicked because they thought that this could happen to them, because everyone from the Islamic society, or mainly the Saudi society, they thought they targeted because they had the misconception that she was targeted as a hate crime.
The police reaction to Nahid's murder was strong, it was clear, it was immediate, and it was in great numbers.
The Essex Police investigations into both murders were incredibly extensive. The 2 murder inquiries were actually kept separate but parallel, with some senior officers overseeing both to see if there were similarities between the 2 murders and if there was just one perpetrator. During the course of the investigations, there were hundreds of hours of CCTV images studied, and dozens of those were released to the public to try and identify people who were either walking along the Salary Brook Trail around the time of Nahid's murder or walking through Castle Park at the time of Jim Atfield's murder. There were also a number of knives examined, I believe more than 150, although none of those were actually linked to the crime. And there were also hundreds and hundreds of witness statements taken during the course of the investigation. In relation to the James Atfield murder, there were actually 10 people arrested in connection with the offence in the immediate months following Jim Atfield's death, but those people were all later released without charge and found to not be involved within the investigation. The investigation involved more than 10,000 staffing hours from Essex Police, and it is estimated to have cost around £2.6 million in the bid to find James Fairweather.
I've represented the area for nearly 25 years, and I've never known a reaction like it. People were afraid to go out on their own anywhere, any time of the day, but especially in the hours of darkness. The police advice was not to go out alone, not to go into isolated areas, and try and stay in if you could, but if you were to go out, make sure that you were in a group. And it was like a sense that a conflict or something really serious where you had to stay in your own home, like a curfew, was going on. And yeah, the sense of shock and horror was palpable.
Because of a previous incident with a knife, James Fairweather had been interviewed by the police. So, with the entire community on high alert, one would assume that the 15-year-old killer would lie low. But Fairweather had other plans. By May 2015, it appears he may have been ready to kill again. But fortunately, his plans were about to be thwarted.
The alarm had been raised by a lone female dog walker who had spotted him lurking in bushes along the Salary Brook Trail, not far from where Nahid Al-Mania had been killed. She had her suspicions aroused by seeing him walking along the trail and then apparently ducking behind a bush, and recalled the warnings given out by police in the wake of both murders that had taken place the previous year. Spotting another dog walker, again a lone female, heading in the boy's direction, she warned him not to approach, but together the pair of them edged closer towards where she had seen the teenager to try and see what he was doing. When they saw that he was still apparently hiding along the trail, they then contacted the police and quite bravely stayed there on the phone to the police until an officer arrived. A single police officer was unarmed, arrived at the scene, spoke to James Fairweather just to try and establish what he was doing, and arrested him for possession of a knife. Also came to light that James Fairweather, as well as having a knife on him, was wearing thick gardening gloves, presumably to try and conceal his identity. And there was a startling image released by police of his arrest where you can see the gloves and his handcuffs at the time of his arrest, and he was first taken to Colchester Police Station.
James Fairweather made a confession at Colchester Police Station, admitting he carried out both murders. He also claimed that voices in his head told him to carry out the murders.
Because my voices were talking to me, you need to make a sacrifice or we're going to come and get you, you need to do it. And I saw him, it was laying on the grass, like that, it was like, just fast asleep, swear he was drunk. And he goes, he's the one, do it. So I went up to him, can I stand up?
Yes.
Went up to him, stood over like that, open that. So I stabbed him first there, and I'd done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing louder and louder.
When he was arrested, he was wearing latex gloves, which showed a forensic awareness. So in that regard, he was premeditated. He also was able, when he was arrested, he was looking up things on Google, such as how to get away with murder due to claiming diminished responsibility, and how to get away with murder in regards to hearing voices in his head, things like that. So he obviously was very premeditated, not only committing his crimes and preparing for them, but also in getting away with them.
James Fairweather claimed that he was hearing a number of voices and seeing hallucinations as well. These range from all sorts of things to male voices. I think there were 3 speaking in his head, telling him to do things, commanding him to do things such as making sacrifices. He also saw young girls in scenes reminiscent of a horror film, I suppose, walking about his house. I think on one incident he talked about a baby as well, and a head stick. I remember that phrase because it was so unusual. What is a head stick? He also talked about people with axes as well, commanding him to do things or threatening him. And I think on at least one occasion he tried to attack one of these apparitions, trying to stab them. I think on one occasion he was also told to stab one of the young girls that he had seen in a hallucination. He actually went to the kitchen in his house to get a knife from the drawer to go and stab her. But of course when he returned, the girl was gone.
When James Fairweather was about to attack James Atfield, his first victim, he was feeling from a position of moral superiority and a feeling of pure power, that he had the power to choose whether James Atfield, who was this vulnerable man on a park bench, worse for wear from alcohol, he had the decision whether this man lived or died. James Fairweather was obsessed with serial killers. James Fairweather would have been what is regarded as a potential serial killer or an emerging serial killer, in regards that he was convicted of 2 murders, but if he hadn't have been caught, he would have definitely committed more. In fact, he told a psychiatrist in August 2014 that he was going to go on and kill at least 15 more people. And why? Because he wanted to emulate those that he did follow and was obsessed with, the likes of Peter Sutcliffe, the likes of Ted Bundy, other violent serial killers. So in regards to that, when he was attacking his victims, as each kill happened, he would have been elated that he was becoming a serial killer, that he was going to emulate the people he looked up to. And we know that because he used to take out newspaper clippings of the murders. He used to watch news programs of the killings, sitting there at home, watching the news footage, watching the crime watch reconstructions, fully aware that he was the man police were looking for.
James Fairweather was 15 years old when he committed 2 of the most serious crimes known to man: murder. How could someone so young do something so terrible? And what existed in his background or his mental state to turn a seemingly average young man into an emerging serial killer? In May 2015, James Fairweather admitted to the murders of 33-year-old James Atfield and 31-year-old Nahad Al-Manea the previous year. Police had undertaken an intensive investigation, and the assumption was that an experienced killer could be at large. But Fairweather was a 15-year-old schoolboy, and he was caught just as he was about to strike again. But what was it about James Fairweather that had led him down this path? His problems appear to have surfaced first when his school attendance became erratic.
He was skipping school and getting himself into trouble. And one of the aspects of the case that we had to look into was why that was. As it turned out, when he was being seen by psychiatrists, he was diagnosed for the first time as having autism. And that had never been picked up before, even though it's clear that in his younger years, he already was autistic.
There is a condition called autistic psychopathy. It was first described in 1938 by Hans Asperger, and I have retitled this tiny group of children with autism who kill as criminal autistic psychopathy, and so I brought back the old term. In actual fact, most people with autism are highly moral, highly ethical, would never do anything like this, but there is a tiny subcategory who do these kind of things, and you identify the way you identify these, taking the history, is these are children who have poor eye contact, they have problems reading faces, they have problems reading, socializing, they're naive and immature, they're loners, they're bullied in school, they have problems sharing their thoughts, very poor communication, they repeat words, they speak in a monotonous tone of voice or a high-pitched tone of voice. They want the same routine every day, and they have narrow interests. For example, they're obsessed with maybe guns, they're obsessed with serial killers, so they have these, they're obsessed with dead animals, looking inside of dead animals.
He seemed to have quite a deep-seated hatred of women. Perhaps before he came onto rape fantasies, he talked about wanting to punch girls in the face after having consensual sex with them. A lot of this seemed to stem from the fact that he'd only had one sort of sexual encounter. It appeared that he'd had a kiss with a girl the year before when he was age 14, but nothing else had happened since then. As well as watching violent films, he also was watching very violent and depraved pornography while he was at home alone, and this seemed to give rise to a number of the kind of rape and violent sex fantasies that he then seemed to enjoy.
In terms of what leads to young people to commit acts such as murder, it's important to consider a number of factors, one being environmental factors. A lot of young people who go on to commit murder tend to come from broken homes and lack good role models, which teach them the basic moral principles that govern our lives. Another factor is psychological factors. A lot of young people who commit murder tend to have undiagnosed mental illness, which unfortunately is only kind of determined or uncovered after being arrested, after they committed their crime. This, along with their young age, tends to make it difficult for them to deal with abstract concepts such as the finality of death and mortality. Another important factor that leads to young people committing crimes such as murder is also social factors. A lot of them tend to be rather isolated and lack strong peer relationships. They struggle to maintain and create those sort of relationships. And they tend to often be victims of bullying as well. And in some cases that can lead to a manifestation of anger and aggression, which they tend to project onto their victims that they perceive as weaker than themselves.
Now, one of the things that's an issue about children who grow up invisible is that they have difficulties about being seen, and that's why you get the attacks on the eyes, and that's something you only, I think in my experience, I've only found in people who've been classed as mentally disordered offenders, people who have got an acceptance of the fact that there is some level of mental illness, that there's been a distortion of the functioning of the brain to allow for that to happen. But from a psychoanalytic point of view, what I would be saying is that as a child, he either felt unseen or looked at to the point that he was not able to just be free, that he was being looked at and studied and criticised, and that would, with him, develop a distortion of that ability to see and be seen that you find in normal social interaction. You know, people hopefully are happy to be looked at and to look at other people. That's quite extreme in autism. Autistic children often don't like to be seen. They've got a real issue about eye contact. They can't bear that looking and seeing interactive process. So I mean, how that gets distorted into going so far as to say, I will actually change it into killing. It seems with this young man, it was about the internet research, and he got latched on to something that then grew into being something, I can do that, I can do that. He could do it, so I can do it. And by that time, he's no longer thinking, he's just functioning on a belief that it's something he can do, that he'll feel good about.
James Fairweather was treated at his school by certain other pupils as a weakling. He was bullied, he was made to feel inferior. When he came across a vulnerable victim, he would have felt that he had a superiority over them, physically, and in terms of the fact that he was armed and that he was going to commit harm to them. He would have put himself in the position as the judge, jury, and executioner when he came upon them. In fact, during the trial, he tried to say that he was hearing voices and things like that. One of the things he said he heard was that the murders were sad, but that they had to be sacrificed because they had committed sin, which in itself is a contradiction. But it goes to show you that if he did believe that, he was trying to put himself as some sort of moral superiority over both his victims. However, we know that's not true because the court psychiatrist said that he was not hearing voices, that there was just an effort to try and get convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. And the court psychiatrist didn't believe him, and thankfully the jury didn't either.
There's some evidence of instability in his upbringing, long periods of time alone, so failure of attachment, and a development of a sense of self as somebody who can be exciting and important. And in order to do that, from his research into serial killers, he's decided that the way that he can be important and notorious or well-known, famous, whatever, is by becoming a serial killer, and so actually set about planning to do that.
There is one very important point, and that is differentiating reality from fantasy. They move between reality and fantasy so much that one second they're in reality and the next second they're in fantasy. They don't have a very clear reality sense because they're moving between fantasy and reality. There's so much in their head that at times they hardly know what's happening outside is different from what's happening inside. And so this makes the question of right and wrong very difficult because there's so much overlap between what's happening between fantasy and reality.
I mean, exposure to violent pornography is going to have more of an influence on people who can't work out what's real and what's not real. And so if the teenagers who find the violent pornography and then watch it again and again and again, they become absorbed in it and it becomes normal, it becomes ordinary behaviour. So therefore it becomes something that they can do. And the more susceptible they are, I mean, if they're not susceptible, they won't even go and look for it in the first place. So they're obviously looking for something that puts some meaning into their lives. And unfortunately, some of them put that meaning into their lives into violence and to doing horrendous acts against other people that become almost normal to them.
What was interesting to learn about James Fairweather's mental health was actually that his father had also been treated for mental health issues when he was younger as well. And there has been some suggestion that there is an element, at least, of genetic predisposition to these sorts of conditions. And therefore one might have asked why, given that James Fairweather was assessed by a mental health expert, why more wasn't done to pick up on those background elements as well as James Fairweather's actual behaviour.
Voices in the head, lots of people hear voices in their head, and that doesn't mean that they've got a serious mental illness. Then we're all capable of hearing voices from time to time. It usually depends on whose voices that you're hearing. If you're hearing a critical parent, then it's almost a memory voice that you're hearing. If you hear persecutory voices, then they are representative of you feeling afraid of something. So whatever the voices are saying has some relationship to what your deepest, innermost fear is. So if the dad was somebody who had some deep fears, then in some way he will have communicated that to his son because he wouldn't be able to help it because it'd be part of his personality. So that may have interfered with his ability to be relaxed in his relationship with his son. So you get the knock-on effect of James just not knowing why his dad's not relaxed with him. And as a little child, hasn't got any language for saying, why aren't you relaxed with me, Dad? You know, he's just left with the feelings of being unconnected, uncertain, invisible, all of those sorts of things, which is then the feeding ground, if you like, for the development of something else.
Shortly before the first killing, he'd committed a knife-point robbery, which the jury heard about, and he'd been placed on a referral order and therefore was being supervised by the local authority in the social services, including an educational psychologist. And what was very striking about the case is that the psychologist didn't pick up the fact that James appeared to suffer from autism. And that's much more a discipline for a psychologist than it is for a psychiatrist. And the issue that struck me as particularly tragic about this case is that if James's autism had been discovered and identified earlier than it was, in other words, after the killings, and if he'd been given the appropriate support for his autism, it may be that the obsessional behaviour that he developed about killing, and therefore enacting them out himself, which what the jury found he'd done, none of that may have happened because it could have been contained and monitored and regulated, and none of that happened.
Can teenagers be truly held responsible for the hideous acts they commit, or are they the victims of a society which failed to protect them? Teenager James Fairweather was apprehended while planning a third murder in May 2015. In April 2016, he was found guilty of 2 previous murders and sentenced to life with a minimum of 27 years in prison. But can someone so young be held responsible for his actions?
The trial was held down at Guildford Crown Court, and it was held by a High Court judge. It lasted 2 weeks, and almost every day new facts were coming out about either the horrific nature of the crimes or the horrific nature of James Fairweather's personality.
One of the initial things we had to deal with James was to find out whether he accepted responsibility for the killings or not. Clearly, there were some very detailed admissions from him to the police in interview.
Went up to him, stood over like that, not helping that. So I stabbed him first there. I'd done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing and laughing and laughing louder and louder.
We quite deliberately didn't want to ask James the question whether he accepted being the killer or not until we were satisfied that his mental state was such that any answer he gave us would be a reliable answer. And so we deliberately held back from asking him that crucial question until quite late in the day, after we got some preliminary psychiatric reports about his mental state. And once we were satisfied that we could properly ask him whether he had committed the killings and what his state of mind was at the time, we did so, and he did then say to us that he was indeed responsible for the killings. The only question then is, what was his state of mind? And we had quite a body of psychiatric evidence, 3 separate psychiatrists, all of whom believed he was suffering from diminished responsibility, which presented him with a partial defence to the charge of murder. To my mind, although the jury rejected his defence and found that he was of a mental state to be guilty of murder rather than manslaughter, it seemed to me that the horrific nature of the killings themselves, and given his young age at the time, indicated that whatever the legal position, which was a matter for the jury, not for me, these killings were the work of a very troubled young man indeed. And I think anybody who dealt with him agreed with that view.
So the jury took around 8 hours to return a verdict, and when they did come back, it was unanimous that he had committed murder and that the defence of diminished responsibility didn't apply.
Because James was convicted of 2 counts of murder, the judge had no option but to impose a life sentence, because the sentence fixed in law for murder is one of life imprisonment. And so he received 2 concurrent terms of life imprisonment. What the judge then had to do, as judges do in every murder case, is go on to set a minimum term that a defendant has to serve before they become eligible for parole. And in this case, the judge set a minimum term of 27 years for James to serve before he becomes eligible for parole. Now, that doesn't mean, as some people mistakenly believe, that he will be released after 27 years. He may never be released, I don't know. But until the parole board is satisfied that he no longer presents a danger to the public, then he won't be released. And that will depend on reports prepared on him over the next 27 years, any changes that occur with him psychiatrically, because after the case was ended, rather than going off to prison, the judge exercised a power available to him to immediately transfer him back to a secure psychiatric unit, where he will remain until they consider him fit to go back into a normal custodial setting, and then he'll be transferred to prison to serve the balance of his sentence.
I think there was a sense of relief, a sense of closure in the community about James's sentence, because the whole community, the whole of Colchester, had been so taken aback that we were increasingly had to be vigilant because there was potentially a serial killer on the loose, and it took Colchester back for a while. It put us in national headlines for the wrong reasons, and there was a sense of shock that we're still getting over, even now, after quite a length of time, and we're still building up our confidence and our wish to make Colchester and bring Colchester to people's attention for the right reasons. So yeah, a real sense of shock and dismay, but the sentence, we think, generally people have said to me they thought it was the right sentence. It's just and it's right.
Well, nobody's inherently bad, nobody's born bad, so James Fairweather, as well as anybody else, is a victim of a system that didn't understand him early enough, really, that didn't pick up on the indications that that was the way he was going, because that wasn't a spontaneous thing, was it? It's a planned thing, so somebody could have picked up on something earlier with him. From my point of view, I'm an optimist. I would always say that anybody can, there's always something you can do to attempt rehabilitation. There are some people where I have in the past been forced to say, though, this person cannot be allowed to be free without supervision because they can't actually get hold of that need to value another person to value another person, really. But I mean, with him, I would have thought that probably he might be helped with some medication if he is hearing voices, and they're persecutory voices as opposed to critical parent voices. So that would need more exploration. But the other thing would be again, in-depth psychotherapy to look at his attachment needs and to help him to get in touch with that little child that was okay before things happened to him that made him go off on the path that he went on. Again, not easy work and not readily available, but it is available, and hopefully he may be able to access that.
The reality is, a big part of rehabilitation is showing genuine remorse. James Fairweather has never said sorry. He has never shown any genuine remorse for what he did to those two innocent victims. Didn't care. In fact, when he was sentenced to 27 years by the judge at the conclusion of his trial, he turned around and said, "I don't give a damn." And he looked at his parents up in the public gallery, who were very visibly upset, obviously, at their son being sentenced to life imprisonment. He turned around and said, "Keep your chin up." Very strange behaviour. Another part of rehabilitation is understanding your actions. James Fairweather has never chosen to try and understand his actions as to why he did what he did. He never confessed outright and gave the proper reasons for it. He tried to say that he was hearing voices. He tried to blame violent paranoid schizophrenia, which he wasn't suffering from. It was done in an effort to convince the jury that he was guilty of manslaughter by diminished responsibility, but he wasn't responsible for a double murder, which in fact he was.
I think James can be rehabilitated. Clearly, that will depend to a significant degree on his response to psychiatric treatment. Whilst accepting, as I must as a lawyer, the jury's verdict and the correctness of it, and we didn't appeal his conviction. Nevertheless, it seems to me that his psychiatric state was responsible for the 2 deaths. Clearly he carries responsibility for it and accepted his responsibility, albeit on the basis of manslaughter, not murder. But it does seem to me he's not somebody who is genuinely and purely evil.
The reality is that he has never shown any genuine remorse, he's never said sorry, and he's never chosen to try and understand his actions. So in regards to James Fairweather, I think it's incredibly unlikely that he can ever be rehabilitated. And another thing about him was he was extremely premeditated in regards that he was, and this is another thing that made sure that he wasn't hearing voices. He had a cooling off period from June 2014, after the murder of Naheed, to May 2015, when he attempted to kill his 3rd victim. Now, the reason for that cooling off period, and serial killers or potential serial killers do have cooling off periods, is because they realise the police are hunting for them. Overgrowth in Colchester had been cut away, people were not going out, he was aware. So he waited for the media hype and the police investigation to die down before he tried to kill again. Someone who genuinely hears voices does not have a cooling off period. If there was periods in between voices telling him to do these acts, it wouldn't be the period of time between the murder of Naheed in June 2014 and the attempted 3rd attack in May 2015.
I do have an amount of sympathy with him. I think there are a number of victims in this case. There's obviously James Atfield's family, there's Naheed's family, but there's also the family of James Fairweather, who have been deeply affected by this. He needs to be punished for carrying out such terrible crimes, but he needs to be rehabilitated. And I would hope that after he's served his sentence, he can come back, realise what he's done and play a useful part in the community going forward, because that's just the way my feelings are about the criminal justice system, that it must help to improve and rehabilitate people, or else what's it there for? I don't think James Fairweather was insane. I think obviously he had huge issues in his life. And there are elements in our education system and in the health system that obviously failed him. And so we need to improve on those things and learn from those things. But let's not get away from the fact that he carried out those murders, and there's a huge degree of personal responsibility that he must take for that. But yes, my belief is he wasn't insane. There were failures in the system, but also he's got to stand up, and this will affect him for the rest of his life, obviously, and he has to take some responsibility for that.
He is a very troubled young man who, on any view, suffered considerable difficulties in relation to his mental state, and that led him to kill 2 people. It's a tragedy for them, and it seems to me it's an equal tragedy for James Fairweather. How he will respond to treatment is impossible to say. When one develops an obsession, whether it be with serial killers or anything else, it's very difficult to rid oneself of that obsession completely. It's like an addiction. And it may be that he never can. But it does seem to me he's somebody capable of rehabilitation, providing he's willing to fully address what he did and why he did it.
No, I don't think so. I don't think anyone like that should be rehabilitated. I know that sounds nasty, but I don't have feelings for him. I hope he stays inside till the day he dies. That's what I hope. It doesn't matter what is wrong with you, there is no excuse to do what he has done. No excuse.
If you feel like somebody is a real danger to the society, why should they be on the streets?
At times he did show behaviour that was psychopathic, yet he was never diagnosed as a psychopath. I mean, for him to turn around after being sentenced to 27 years and say, I don't give a damn, and look over at his parents in front of all the police officers and the victims' families, look over at his parents who are visibly upset and say, keep your chin up. Well, that's pure psychopathy. But he was never diagnosed as a psychopath. In regards to him being a victim of society or the environment around him, he came from a fairly stable background. And he knew the difference between right and wrong. He just chose to go down the path he did. As I said, it was a combination between the obsession, which became impossible to contain, anger because of what he was experiencing at school. That lethal combination made him a murderer. And once he committed his first murder, he was feeling powerful, he would have had adrenaline, and he would have realised that he was on the way to emulating the serial killers that he was obsessed with.
My feelings about James Fairweather are predominantly ones of great sadness, to be honest. I do feel he, to a degree, was let down by the system. As it happens, I have an autistic son myself, and so the late diagnosis of his autism is something which struck me as particularly unfortunate, and I think has a very significant part to play in what was then to happen. Whether it can be said that an early diagnosis would have prevented any of this, I simply cannot say, and I don't think anybody can. But I do feel to some degree he's been let down by the system. I think the fact that his deteriorating behaviour at school wasn't addressed in a different way from how it was, where I remember seeing in one of his school reports, a teacher just simply dismissed him as a naughty boy without looking to see why. It seems to me things like that and attitudes like that do him a disservice and ultimately lead, although nobody could possibly predict it, to the terrible events of 2014 and 15.